We have watched the run up in value of Bitcoin since you made that announcement, the idea of it being adopted much more globally, and the view, I think, that other rivals of yours and others in the financial community are going to be coming in at some point behind you. We'll see whether they do. But let me just ask you just straight up about the value proposition of Bitcoin, because a lot of people say, what is its true value? What is the inherent value of Bitcoin? How do you value it? I know you own some yourself. How do you value it?
Yeah. Well, I think all forms of money are based on trust and set values that come from that trust. I think if you take a step back, Andrew, especially with the pandemic, you've seen the use of cash decline precipitously. Something like 40 to 70% of consumers no longer want to handle cash. And just like every industry is digitizing right now, that is also happening in the financial services world. There is no question that people are flocking to digital payments and digital forms of currency. And one of the things that we looked at, and we talked to regulators around the world, central banks around the world, and it became clear to me that it's a matter of, not if, but when and how you'll start to see more and more central banks issue forms of digital currencies. And I think you'll have more and more utility happen with cryptocurrencies. One of the things that we allowed is not just making it easy to buy, sell, and hold cryptocurrencies, but very importantly, early next year, we're going to allow cryptocurrencies to be a funding source for any transaction happening on all 28 million of our merchants. And that will significantly bolster the utility of cryptocurrencies.
Dan, but just to put a fine point on that, because then you start to talk about Bitcoin not as an asset or commodity, rather, but as a true currency, if you will. However, I think it's worth explaining to the audience that you don't intend for, if, for example, I had Bitcoin and I was going to buy a pizza over PayPal, for me to use my Bitcoin to actually pay the merchant and then for them to receive Bitcoin. My understanding is that I would pay in Bitcoin and you would immediately transact into US dollars. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Andrew. So what would happen is you would buy, say, Bitcoin on our platform, and you'd hold it, and that Bitcoin would have a certain amount of value. And say you wanted to make a transaction at any of our merchants, we would tell you exactly how much of that Bitcoin you need to make that transaction. And we would then immediately translate that amount of Bitcoin into fiat currency. And so the volatility goes away. You know exactly how much you need for that transaction. It would be converted into fiat. And then we would use that fiat currency, US dollar, for instance, to make the transaction at the retailer. So the retailer doesn't have to accept a new form of currency like crypto. They're basically doing this in fiat currency. They don't have to worry about volatility anymore, but the consumer now has another funding instrument, just like cash or a debit card or whatever it may be in their PayPal wallet to be able to use to make a transaction. So we're making it very simple and easy for people to utilize crypto as a funding source.
Dan, I appreciate the bull case in that scenario, but I also appreciate that there's a bear case in that scenario, because it suggests that fiat currency is here to stay in a very meaningful way. And I wanted to ask you about a comment that Jamie Dimon made last week to me when we were talking about Bitcoin. JP Morgan's been supportive of crypto and increasingly even Bitcoin itself. His concern, I think longer term, and I don't want to speak for him, but is this idea that if it ever gets to a quote unquote escape velocity of sorts, that regulators could come in, given that they have their own interests in a fiat currency, as you might imagine.
Well, I think it's foundational that we work hand in hand with regulators. I mean, our move into the crypto space happened because we worked hand in hand with New York Department of Financial Services received the first conditional bit license to go and do this. I don't think you can manage and move money without working hand in hand with regulators, whether that be regulators.
But I think the question is whether a United States but I think the question is whether central banks around the country, around the world rather, at some point may say, you know what, we're not doing it this way, or may seek to effectively crowd out a Bitcoin, if you will, by making their own currencies digital, and what you think that does for the value of something like a Bitcoin, and then, of course, all of the customers who seem to be on PayPal now using it to buy up Bitcoins.
Yeah. Well, I do think as paper money slowly dissipates and disappears from how people are using transactions, central banks, especially on the retail side, will need to replace paper money with forms of digital fiat currency.
Everybody is starting to wake up about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. They want your Bitcoin. They do not have enough for what is about to come. That is some bullish news on Bitcoin. Let's go.